I pulled into the parking lot of Pine Ridge Motel just as the sun dropped behind the Adirondack Mountains. The place looked exactly like the photos online, a single-story L-shaped building with peeling blue paint and a flickering neon sign that read Vacancy in red letters. 12 numbered doors faced the gravel lot, with dense pine forest pressing in from all sides. Taking the night shift at a remote motel wasn't my first choice, but after losing my waitressing job and with rent due next week, I couldn't afford to be picky. The ad had promised decent pay, minimal responsibilities, and included a small room behind the office where I could stay on work nights. Perfect for someone like me who was trying to juggle 2 other part-time jobs during the day. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat and headed toward the office, a small building connected to one end of the L. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. "Hello?" I called out. The office looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Wood paneling, a faded countertop, and a wall of numbered hooks behind the desk holding old-fashioned metal keys. A rustling sound came from the back room before an elderly woman appeared, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of someone whose joints protested every movement. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and deep wrinkles lined her face like a road map. "Sarah Mitchell?" she asked, her voice surprisingly strong despite her fragile appearance. "Yes, that's me. I'm here for the night clerk position." She nodded once. "I'm the owner. Everyone just calls me Granny." She didn't offer a handshake, instead moving behind the counter and pulling out a thin folder. "The job is simple. Check guests in, take payments, answer the phone. You work from 8 at night until 6 in the morning." I nodded eagerly. "That works perfectly with my other jobs." Granny studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if assessing something beyond my appearance. Finally, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. "These are the rules," she said, sliding it toward me. "Follow them exactly." I picked up the paper. The rules were handwritten in shaky cursive. 1. Do not check in any guests after 10 p.m., regardless of vacancy. Tell them we're full. 2. If a guest in room 3 calls to report strange noises, tell them it's just the wind. If they insist someone is there, hang up immediately. 3. If you hear children laughing after midnight, lock yourself in the back office and turn off all lights until it stops. 4. If a man in a hat enters the lobby after 1 a.m., tell him you're not ready yet. Do not engage further. 5. Always prepare room 7 when requested, even if no reservation exists. 6. Never under any circumstances go outside between midnight and 5 a.m. I looked up, fighting back a smile. Great. My new boss was a superstitious old lady with bizarre quirks. "Is this serious?" I asked, trying to keep my tone respectful. Granny's expression didn't change. "Deadly serious. Break any of these rules and I'll know. Break 'em twice and you're fired." I nodded, tucking the paper into my pocket. "Got it. The check-in system is simple," she continued, pointing to an ancient desktop computer. "Reservations are logged here. Walk-ins pay cash up front. My quarters are through that door." She pointed to a door behind the counter. "But don't disturb me unless it's an emergency." She walked me through the basic procedures, showing me how to process payments and where supplies were kept. The whole orientation took less than 20 minutes. "Any questions?" she asked when she finished. I had dozens, mostly about the strange rules, but something in her demeanor suggested she wouldn't appreciate them. "No, I think I've got it." "Good, I'll leave you to it then." Without another word, she disappeared through the door to her quarters, the lock clicking loudly behind her. I sighed and settled into the chair behind the desk. The clock on the wall read 8:15, which meant I had nearly 10 hours ahead of me. I pulled out the list of rules again, reading them over more carefully. They had to be the product of an eccentric mind, probably developed over years of isolation in this remote location. I tucked the paper back into my pocket and turned my attention to the ancient computer, familiarizing myself with the reservation system. The first few hours passed quietly. I played games on my phone, browsed social media, and watched the occasional car pass by on the distant highway. The forest surrounding the motel seemed to grow denser as night fell, the tall pines blocking out most of the moonlight and leaving the parking lot in shadow except for the pools of yellow light from the fixtures mounted above each door. At 9:25, headlights swept across the lot as a sedan pulled in. A man in his mid-30s climbed out, glancing nervously at the surrounding woods before hurrying to the office door. The bell jingled as he entered. He wore a rumpled button-down shirt and khaki pants, like someone who'd been driving all day. "Evening," I said, putting on my customer service smile. "Welcome to Pine Ridge Motel." "Hi, do you have any rooms available?" He kept glancing at the window as if expecting something to appear. I checked the computer. "Yes, we have several rooms open. How many nights will you be staying?" "Just tonight. I'm passing through on my way to Buffalo." I nodded, clicking through the reservation screen. "I'll need your name and a credit card." "David Clark," he said, sliding his card across the counter. I ran his card and handed him the key to room 3. "You're all set, Mr. Clark. Checkout is at 11 tomorrow morning." He took the key, his fingers trembling slightly. Thanks. Is it always this quiet out here? I'm not sure. It's actually my first night on the job. His eyes widened slightly. Oh, well, good luck, I guess. As he left, I remembered the second rule about room 3 calling to report strange noises. I wondered if there was something wrong with that particular room. Maybe it had plumbing issues or was near a tree that scratched against the window when the wind blew. That would explain the rule at least. 10 minutes later, a minivan pulled into the lot. A tired-looking couple emerged with 2 small children in tow. The father came in to check in while the mother waited with the kids. "Room for 4, please," he said, rubbing his eyes. "We've been driving since Cleveland." I got them set up in room 4, and they thanked me before shuffling off to their accommodation, the children whining about being hungry despite the late hour. By 10 o'clock, the motel had settled back into silence. I found myself yawning, already dreading the long night ahead. Maybe I could convince Granny to let me bring a small TV for my shifts. At 10:15, headlights once again swept across the parking lot as a sleek black car pulled up directly in front of the office. A woman stepped out, tall, well-dressed, maybe in her 30s. She walked with confident strides to the door. The bell announced her arrival as she stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of expensive perfume. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth and pleasant. "I need a room for the night." I opened my mouth to respond automatically when I remembered the first rule. Do not check in any guests after 10 p.m., regardless of vacancy. Tell them we're full. I glanced at the clock, 10:17. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're actually full for the night," I said, trying to sound apologetic. The woman's smile didn't waver, but something changed in her eyes. "That's strange," she said, looking pointedly at the key rack behind me, where most of the keys still hung on their hooks. "Your sign says vacancy." I swallowed hard, suddenly uncomfortable under her gaze. "I'm sorry, there must have been a mistake with the sign. We're completely booked." She leaned forward slightly, placing her hands on the counter. Under the fluorescent lights of the office, her eyes caught the light in a way that seemed wrong. They reflected it back like an animal's might, with an unnatural brightness. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, her voice now carrying an edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I only need the room for a few hours." I forced myself to maintain eye contact despite a growing urge to look away. "I'm sorry, but we have no availability tonight." For a long moment, she didn't move or speak. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Then, without another word, she straightened up and turned toward the door. Her movements were fluid but somehow wrong, as if she was forcing herself to move at a normal human pace. She paused at the door, looking back at me over her shoulder. Her face was perfectly composed, but there was nothing warm or human in her expression anymore. The bell jingled as she left, and I watched through the window as she returned to her car and drove away, her taillights quickly disappearing into the darkness. An unexpected chill ran through me, and I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the strange feeling of dread that had settled over me. For the first time, I wondered if Granny's rules might have actual purpose behind them. I pulled the paper from my pocket and read through the remaining rules again, this time with a growing sense that my night at Pine Ridge Motel might be anything but ordinary. 20 minutes after the strange woman left, I was still shaken. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, how her eyes had caught the light wrong, the way she moved too smoothly, and that unnatural stillness when I refused her a room. I told myself I was being ridiculous. She was probably just some entitled rich lady who wasn't used to hearing no. Nothing supernatural about that. I tried to focus on my work instead. The computer screen glowed with the night's reservation records as I typed in the details of the guests who had checked in earlier. The family with 2 kids in room 4, David Clark in room 3. I entered their information, double-checking that everything was correct. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of the ancient heating system and the occasional creak of the building settling. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows, the forest beyond the parking lot a solid wall of black. No stars tonight. The clouds had rolled in, blocking out even the moon. I tapped my pen against the desk, thinking about Granny's rules. Maybe they were just the paranoid instructions of an old woman who'd been alone in this remote place too long. But the way that woman had looked at me, the shrill ring of the phone startled me so badly I knocked over my coffee cup. Thankfully, it was nearly empty, but I still scrambled to mop up the small puddle with a handful of tissues before grabbing the receiver. "Pine Ridge Motel, how can I help you?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. "There's someone outside my window." The words tumbled out in a rushed whisper. It was David Clark, the man from room 3. His voice shook with unmistakable fear. I can hear scratching on the glass, and footsteps. Someone's walking around inside my room. I remembered the second rule immediately. If a guest in room 3 calls to report strange noises, tell them it's just the wind. If they insist someone is there, hang up immediately. "Mr. Clark, I'm sure it's just the wind," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "The trees around the property can make some strange sounds when—" No, it's not the wind," he cut me off, his voice rising in pitch. "I can see a figure outside. Right now, standing by my window, I can see it." My mouth went dry. According to the rules, I needed to hang up right away. But this was a real person, genuinely frightened. How could I just— "It's looking at me," David whispered, his voice dropping even lower. "Oh God, it's—" I pressed the button to end the call, my finger moving almost without my conscious decision. The rules said to hang up immediately, and some instinct told me those rules mattered more than I understood. As soon as I put the phone down, I moved to the front window of the office. From there, I had a partial view of the motel rooms. Room 3 was halfway down the row, its curtains glowing with the light from inside. As I watched, the door to room 3 swung open, and David stepped outside. He had a flashlight in his hand, its beam cutting through the darkness as he moved cautiously away from his door. He was fully dressed in the same rumpled clothes he'd arrived in, as if he hadn't even tried to sleep. David walked a few steps into the parking lot, then turned and aimed his flashlight back toward his room. The beam illuminated the window, and what I saw made me stop breathing. There was another David standing motionless by the window. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things. But when I looked again, there were definitely two identical men. The real David, at least the one holding the flashlight, stood in the parking lot, while his perfect duplicate remained by the window, wearing the exact same clothes with the exact same face. The only difference was the complete stillness of the one by the window. The David in the parking lot took a tentative step toward his room. The other David turned its head to look at him, the movement jerky and wrong, like a film jumping frames. Its neck bent at an angle that didn't seem possible for a human spine. The real David froze in place. Even from this distance, I could see the shock in his posture, the way his arm holding the flashlight began to tremble. The duplicate took a step forward, its whole body moving with that same mechanical wrongness. Another step. Its mouth opened wider than a mouth should be able to open. I ducked below the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs. A second later, a terrible scream tore through the night, raw, primal, cut off abruptly in the middle. The sound pierced through the walls of the office and seemed to echo across the empty parking lot. I stayed crouched behind the counter, counting my breaths, trying to slow them down. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The night outside had gone completely silent again, as if the scream had never happened. Finally, I forced myself to stand up and look through the window again. There was only one David now. He walked calmly back to room 3, his movements smooth and unhurried. The flashlight hung at his side, still on but pointing at the ground. He stepped into his room and closed the door behind him with a gentle click. The phone rang again, making me jump. My hand hovered over the receiver for several rings before I finally picked it up. "Pine Ridge Motel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is David Clark in room 3, said a voice that was technically David's but completely devoid of the panic from minutes ago. It sounded flat, emotionless. Wrong. I wanted to apologize for the false alarm earlier. Everything is fine now. The wind was playing tricks on me. "No problem," I managed to say. "Good night," the voice said. The line went dead. I lowered the phone with shaking hands. What I had just witnessed was impossible. People didn't have duplicates. People didn't move like that. And people who saw something that terrifying didn't call back minutes later with a voice wiped clean of all emotion to claim everything was fine. I looked back at the yellowed paper with Granny's rules, still sitting on the desk where I'd left it. They didn't seem like the eccentric demands of a superstitious old woman anymore. They seemed like survival instructions, and I'd just followed one to the letter. I stood frozen behind the counter for several minutes after hanging up the phone. The voice that had spoken to me wasn't David's, not really. It had his vocal patterns and tone, but lacked any emotion, like someone had hollowed him out and was wearing his voice like an ill-fitting suit. My first instinct was to quit. I could walk out right now, leave the keys on the counter with a hastily scrawled note and never look back. But then I thought about my empty bank account, the rent due next week, and the impossibility of finding another job that would accommodate my chaotic schedule. Besides, where would I go at this hour? My apartment was 45 minutes away, and the thought of driving those dark, winding roads with whatever I'd just seen possibly following me was even more terrifying than staying put. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every sound, checking the window obsessively for any sign of movement near room 3. David, or whatever was pretending to be him, didn't emerge again. When dawn finally broke, casting pale light through the trees, I practically ran to my car, ignoring the tiredness weighing down my limbs. Sleep eluded me that day. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying what I'd seen over and over. 2 identical men, one real, one something else, and then only one remaining. I told myself it couldn't be real. I must have been tired, my eyes playing tricks in the darkness, but the flat, emotionless voice on the phone afterward was impossible to rationalize away. By evening, I'd convinced myself to return. What other choice did I have? I needed this job, and maybe I reasoned with the delusional optimism of the truly desperate. It had been a one-time occurrence. Whatever strange thing had happened in room 3 might never happen again. I arrived 15 minutes early for my shift, half hoping Granny would be there so I could ask her about what I'd witnessed. The office was empty though, with only a note on the counter written in shaky handwriting. Watch the clock. Remember the rules. Next to it sat a small plate covered with plastic wrap containing 2 homemade cookies. I wasn't sure if it was a peace offering or a reward for following the rules last night. Either way, I appreciated the gesture. The night started quietly. At 8:30, a middle-aged couple checked in, asking for a room with a king-sized bed. They were traveling from Vermont to visit their daughter in Syracuse. Their faces looked tired but happy, their wedding rings catching the light as they passed me their credit card. I gave them room 6, as far from room 3 as possible. Shortly after 9, a business traveler arrived. He wore an expensive suit that looked rumpled from a long day of driving and meetings. His eyes were bloodshot, and he barely looked at me as he checked in. His attention focused on his phone. I assigned him room 5, 2 doors down from the couple. At 9:45, just before the cutoff time, a young woman with a small suitcase arrived. She looked about my age, with dark circles under her eyes that rivaled my own. She paid in cash, counting out crisp $20 bills from a worn wallet. When I asked for her ID, she hesitated for just a second before handing over a New York driver's license. I gave her room 8, on the far end of the building. As I watched her walk to her room, I couldn't help wondering if she was running from something or someone. There was a wariness to her movements, the way she scanned the parking lot before opening her door that seemed familiar. It reminded me of myself. The digital clock on the desk turned to 10 p.m. and I felt a small wave of relief wash over me. No more check-ins until morning. I flipped the switch that changed the neon sign from vacancy to no vacancy, even though we still had several empty rooms. I took out my phone trying to distract myself with social media, but found myself constantly glancing up at room 3. The lights were off and there had been no sign of David since last night. I wondered if he was still in there, or if whatever had taken his place had already moved on. Around 10:30, I remembered something Granny had mentioned during my brief orientation. I was supposed to update the guest registry at the end of each night. She'd said the family in room 4 had checked out early that morning. I pulled up the registry on the ancient computer and found their entry, clicking to mark them as departed. I thought about that family, mom, dad, and 2 small children. Had they noticed anything strange during their stay? I tried to recall if Granny had mentioned anything unusual about their checkout, but she'd been characteristically brief. All she'd said was that they'd left early, around 6 a.m. A memory suddenly surfaced, something I'd overheard this morning while gathering my things to leave. Granny had been speaking to someone in the back room, her voice carrying faintly through the thin walls. Those poor children, so quiet when they left. Not natural for young ones to be that still. I shivered, pushing the thought away as I continued updating the registry. It didn't mean anything. Maybe the kids were just tired from the early wake-up, or maybe they'd been sick. There could be 100 normal explanations. Time crawled by. I watched stupid videos on my phone, played a few games, and ate one of Granny's cookies, which was surprisingly delicious, a perfect chocolate chip cookie with just the right amount of chewiness. At 11:20, I got up to use the bathroom in the back office. The small room behind the reception desk contained a basic bathroom, a worn couch that folded out into a bed, and a mini fridge. It wasn't much, but it was where I would be staying on the nights I worked consecutive shifts. I had just returned to my seat when I heard it, a sound so ordinary it took me a moment to realize why it made my blood run cold. Laughter. A child's laughter, clear and bright, coming from somewhere outside. I froze, remembering the 3rd rule: if you hear children laughing after midnight, lock yourself in the back office and turn off all lights until it stops. I glanced at the clock, 11:28 p.m. It wasn't midnight yet. Did the rule apply now? The laughter came again, followed by a high-pitched voice calling out words I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like a young child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, playing some kind of game. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Behind the motel was a small, rundown playground, just a rusty swing set, and a slide that had probably been installed decades ago. In the daytime, I'd barely noticed it. Now it seemed to loom in the shadows, barely visible in the faint light spilling from the motel windows. I couldn't see anyone there, but the laughter came again, followed by a sing-song voice. Ready or not, here I come. A chill ran through me. What child would be playing hide-and-seek in the pitch dark behind an isolated motel? And where were their parents? The clock now read 11:31 p.m. Not midnight, but close enough. Something about that innocent laughter felt wrong, especially after what I'd witnessed last night. I decided not to take any chances. I quickly moved to the back office, locking the door behind me and turning off the lights as the rule instructed. The small room fell into darkness, with only a thin strip of light visible under the door connecting to the main office. The laughter continued, sometimes fading as if moving away, then suddenly louder as if the child had run closer to the building. I sat on the edge of the couch, my hands clutched tightly in my lap, listening. Come out, wherever you are." The child's voice was closer now, just outside the office. How had they gotten around to the front so quickly? For 10 minutes, the pattern continued. Laughter, calling out more laughter. It sounded like normal play, which somehow made it more unsettling in this context. What child plays alone in the dark at nearly midnight? Then around 11:45, the quality of the laughter began to change. It started subtly, a slight elongation of each laugh, stretching the sound unnaturally. The pitch began to waver, dipping lower then shooting higher than any child's voice should go. What had been the infectious giggle of a young child transformed into something mechanical and wrong, like a music box with its mechanisms breaking down. "Calm out," the voice called, the words distorted and warped. The playfulness was gone, replaced by something hungry. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound seemed to penetrate the walls, the door, my hands, my skull, as if it wasn't coming from outside at all but materializing directly inside my head. A new sound joined the laughter, a scraping noise like nails or claws dragging slowly across the exterior walls of the building. It started at the far end of the motel and moved steadily closer to the office, accompanied by that twisted mechanical laughter that no longer resembled anything human. The scraping reached the office wall, circling around to the window. I could hear it moving inch by inch, a deliberate, unhurried sound. Whatever was out there knew I was inside. It was taking its time. I curled up on the couch, pulling a musty blanket over my head like a child hiding from monsters. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, to call for help, but instinct told me that making any sound would be deadly. The scraping reached the back office window, directly behind where I sat. It paused there, and for one terrible moment, the laughter stopped too. In that silence, I heard a soft tapping on the glass, like someone gently requesting entry. Tap, 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 tap. Then the scraping resumed, continuing its circuit around the building. The distorted laughter started again, but growing fainter now, as if whatever made the sound was moving away, losing interest. By 12:30 a.m., both the scraping and the laughter had stopped completely. The night outside fell silent, not even the wind disturbing the trees. I stayed where I was, too terrified to move, counting my breaths to keep from panicking. I waited an additional 30 minutes, just to be sure. Finally, at 1 a.m., I gathered the courage to unlock the back office door and step out into the main office. Everything looked normal. The ancient computer hummed on the desk. The keys hung on their hooks. The digital clock blinked steadily. I moved cautiously to the front window, peering out at the parking lot. All was quiet. The cars belonging to the guests sat undisturbed in their spots. No movement, no sign of any children or anything else. Then I noticed something on the outside of the window, thin lines catching the light from inside the office. I moved closer, squinting to see better. They were scratch marks, deep, deliberate grooves carved into the glass, too precise and too deep to have been made by any animal. They formed no pattern I could recognize, but they were clearly intentional, and they definitely hadn't been there earlier. I touched the inside of the glass with trembling fingers, feeling the slight ridges where the scratches were deepest. Whatever had made these marks had wanted to get inside, and somehow I knew with bone-deep certainty that following Granny's third rule had been the only thing keeping it out. I stood in front of the window for several minutes, my fingertips still tracing the ridges where something had carved deep grooves into the glass. These weren't random scratches or the result of a branch blown against the window during a storm. They were methodical, precise, like someone had used a diamond-tipped tool to etch patterns into the surface, or like something with claws had spent time deliberately marking its territory. I dropped my hand and stepped back, suddenly not wanting to touch the glass anymore. The night remained quiet outside, but I kept glancing toward the playground area behind the motel, half expecting to see a small figure standing there. Nothing moved in the darkness. The rest of my shift passed in tense silence. I jumped at every creak of the old building, at every car that passed on the distant highway. When 6 o'clock finally came, I practically ran to my car, desperate to get away from Pine Ridge Motel and its nighttime visitors. But as I drove home through the pale morning light, questions kept circling in my mind. What had I actually seen last night? What had happened to David? And what kind of place was this motel, really? Sleep came in short, restless bursts that day. When my alarm went off at 6 that evening, I lay in bed debating whether to return at all. The smart thing would be to call Granny, make up some excuse about a family emergency, and never go back. But I kept thinking about my empty bank account, about my upcoming rent payment, about how hard it had been to find a night job that worked with my daytime schedule. And something else pulled at me too, a weird, uncomfortable curiosity. I wanted to understand what was happening at Pine Ridge Motel. I wanted answers. I arrived 45 minutes early for my shift. The sun hadn't completely set yet, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I wanted to see those scratch marks in proper light before darkness fell again. As I pulled in, I noticed the parking lot was empty except for Granny's ancient station wagon parked near her quarters. No guests had checked in yet. Good, that would give me time to investigate. The office door was unlocked. I stepped inside, calling out, "Granny, it's Sarah." No answer came from the back room. The office looked exactly as I'd left it that morning, the computer humming softly, the guest ledger open on the counter, the numbered keys hanging on their hooks behind the desk. I moved immediately to the front window, where I'd seen the scratches last night. In daylight, or what remained of it, they were even more visible. The marks cut deep into the glass, creating patterns that almost looked like writing, though in no alphabet I recognized. Some of the grooves were so deep I was surprised the window hadn't shattered. I ran my fingers over them again, feeling the depth. No animal could have made these. They were too precise, too intentional, and the glass itself was thick, the kind designed to withstand extreme weather. Whatever had made these marks was strong. Checking my handiwork, I jumped and spun around. Granny stood in the doorway leading to her quarters, watching me with those sharp eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Sorry, I was just at the window, not sure how to explain what I was doing. No need to explain. She moved into the room, her steps slow but purposeful. You followed the rules, that's what matters. I wanted to ask her about the scratches, about the child's laughter, about David and his duplicate. I wanted answers to the dozens of questions that had kept me awake all day, but something in her expression stopped me. It wasn't unfriendly, exactly, but it was closed, making it clear she wouldn't be answering questions tonight. Instead, she pointed to the counter where a stainless steel thermos sat next to a folded piece of paper. Left you something to help you stay awake. Night shift is hard on the body. I picked up the note first. Written in the same shaky handwriting as the rules were two simple words. You're learning. Thank you, I said, looking back at Granny. But she had already turned away, shuffling back toward her quarters. Remember the rules, she said over her shoulder. All of them. The door closed behind her with a soft click. I opened the thermos and the rich smell of coffee filled the office. It was still hot, and when I took a cautious sip, I found it was good coffee too, strong and slightly sweet, just how I liked it. As dusk settled into full darkness, I began my shift properly. I checked the reservation book, finding only 2 rooms booked for the night. Room 1 and Room 2, the 2 closest to the office. Both guests arrived within 15 minutes of each other, checking in without incident. The first was an older man who looked like he'd been driving all day, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. The second was a middle-aged woman with a briefcase who barely looked up from her phone during the entire check-in process. By 9 o'clock, with no more guests expected, I settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet night. I switched the sign to no vacancy at 10, even though most of the rooms remained empty. Rule number 1, no check-ins after 10 p.m., regardless of vacancy. The hours ticked by slowly. I sipped Granny's coffee, which somehow stayed hot much longer than it should have. I played games on my phone until the battery ran low, then switched to reading a paperback I'd thrown in my bag. All the while, I found myself glancing up at the clock, watching as it approached 1 a.m. Rule number 4, tell any man in a hat after 1 a.m. that you're not ready yet. At 12:55, I put my book down. My mouth felt dry, and my heart beat faster as the minutes crawled toward 1 o'clock. Would he come tonight? What did the rule even mean? Who was this man in a hat, and what was I supposedly not ready for? The digital clock on the desk flipped to 1 a.m. Nothing happened. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe the rules didn't apply every night. Maybe there were conditions I didn't understand. Maybe the lock on the front door clicked. I looked up sharply. I knew I had locked that door myself after the last guest checked in. I had turned the deadbolt with my own hands, heard it slide into place. The door swung open slowly, revealing the darkness of the parking lot beyond. For a moment, the doorway stood empty. Then a figure stepped into the office. He was tall, so tall his head nearly touched the top of the doorframe. He wore a long black coat that hung to his ankles and moved oddly around him as if stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel. But what caught my attention was his hat, wide-brimmed and black, casting his face in such deep shadow that I couldn't make out any features at all. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs of white, and my fingers went numb against the countertop. The cold was sudden and intense, like someone had opened a door to the Arctic. The man took a step forward, then another. His movements were smooth and deliberate. I waited to hear the sound of his shoes on the linoleum floor, but no sound came. He moved in complete silence, as if he wasn't touching the ground at all. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to duck under the counter, race through the back office, and get out the rear exit, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this person. But I remembered the rule, and some deeper instinct told me that running would be worse, much worse. The man in the hat stopped directly in front of the counter. Though I couldn't see his face beneath the shadow of his hat, I could feel his attention fixed on me. The air between us seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. I swallowed hard, my throat clicking in the silence. The words of the 4th rule echoed in my mind. "I'm not ready yet," I said, my voice coming out as little more than a whisper. The man tilted his head slowly to one side, the movement smooth but somehow wrong, as if his neck had too many joints. He stayed like that for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds considering my response. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, he straightened and turned away. He walked back toward the door, which swung open by itself as he approached. No hand reached for the handle. No one pushed it from outside. It simply opened, as if eager to let him pass. At the threshold, he paused. Without turning around, he spoke. Soon, his voice was like two stones grinding together, deep and rough and ancient. It filled the small office, seeming to come from everywhere at once rather than from the figure at the door. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. The temperature began to rise immediately, the oppressive cold receding. I stood frozen behind the counter, unable to move, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Something white on the counter caught my eye. A piece of paper that hadn't been there before the man in the hat arrived. I stared at it for several seconds before finding the courage to reach out and pick it up. The note was written in Granny's familiar shaky handwriting, but I knew with absolute certainty that she hadn't entered the office during the encounter. The paper had simply appeared. 4 words were written on it. "Are you ready now?" My hands shook so badly that the paper made a rattling sound. I crumpled it into a ball, then immediately regretted it and tried to smooth it out again, as if destroying the note might somehow offend its author. I sat down heavily in the chair, staring at the closed door where the man in the hat had disappeared. The night outside remained dark and still, giving no indication that anything unusual had happened. But everything had changed, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that I had just met the true owner of Pine Ridge Motel. I arrived early for my shift the next evening, the crumpled note from the man in the hat tucked in my pocket. Those 4 words, "Are you ready now?" had haunted me all day, floating to the surface every time I tried to sleep. I needed answers, and Granny was the only person who might provide them. The office looked ordinary in the fading evening light, just a small dated room in a roadside motel. But after 3 nights of impossible things, I knew better. This place existed in some strange liminal space where the rules of reality bent and sometimes broke altogether. Granny was behind the counter when I entered, her small frame hunched over the ancient computer as she pecked at the keyboard with 2 fingers. She looked up when the bell above the door jingled, fixing me with those keen eyes that seemed to see right through me. "You're early," she said, stating the obvious. I pulled the note from my pocket and smoothed it out on the counter between us. "What does this mean?" "The man in the hat left it last night." Granny looked down at the paper, then back at me. A small smile crept across her face, crinkling the deep lines around her eyes. Instead of answering, she shuffled around the counter toward her quarters. "Granny, please," I said, frustration edging into my voice. "I deserve some kind of explanation. What am I supposed to be ready for?" She paused at her door, one gnarled hand resting on the frame. "Some questions answer themselves in time," she said cryptically. Then she disappeared inside, closing the door firmly behind her. I stood there, staring at the closed door, fighting the urge to pound on it and demand answers. But something told me it wouldn't do any good. Granny revealed things on her own schedule, not mine. With a sigh, I tucked the note back into my pocket and settled in for my shift. No guests were scheduled to check in tonight, according to the reservation book, unusual for a Friday, but a relief after the events of the past few nights. Maybe I could finally have a quiet evening without duplicates, children's laughter, or men in hats. The phone rang at 8:30, shattering my hopes for an uneventful night. "Pine Ridge Motel, how can I help you?" I answered, trying to sound professional despite the immediate tension that gripped my shoulders. "I need room 7 tonight," a man's voice said without preamble. He spoke quietly, his tone clipped and efficient. "Let me check our availability," I said automatically, though I already knew we had plenty of vacant rooms. "May I have your name for the reservation?" "The room isn't for me," the caller said. "It's for Mr. Gray. He'll be arriving late, probably around midnight. Make sure the room is clean and ready for him." I felt a chill run down my back, remembering rule number 5, always prepare room 7 when requested, even without a reservation. I reached for the yellowed paper that now lived permanently beside the computer, scanning down to confirm. "Of course, sir," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Room 7 will be ready for Mr. Gray." "Good," the man said, and then hung up without another word. I sat there holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone for several seconds before putting it down. I pulled up the reservation system and checked. There was no booking for a Mr. Gray, no record of the call I'd just received. Room 7 was located in the middle of the motel's L-shaped layout. I hadn't been inside any of the rooms yet, having only worked the front desk for 3 nights. Now I needed to prepare a room for a guest who wasn't in the system, based solely on a cryptic phone call and one of Granny's strange rules. I found the master key in the drawer and headed out into the parking lot. The evening air felt unusually still, with no breeze rustling the surrounding pine trees. My footsteps on the gravel seemed too loud in the silence. Room 7 looked like all the others from the outside. Same peeling blue paint, same brass numbers on the door, same curtained window. I inserted the key with slightly trembling fingers and pushed the door open. The interior was clean but dated. Wood-paneled walls, a queen-sized bed with a faded blue comforter, A small desk with a lamp, and a TV that probably still had a VCR attached. Nothing unusual or threatening. I checked the bathroom, finding fresh towels already stacked on the rack, and travel-sized toiletries arranged on the counter. The room looked ready for a guest, though I wasn't sure what special preparation Mr. Gray might require. I changed the sheets anyway, dusted every surface, and made sure the bathroom was spotless. Whatever or whoever Mr. Gray was, I didn't want to risk breaking Rule 5 by delivering anything less than a perfectly prepared room. Back in the office, the hours ticked by slowly. At 10, I flipped the vacancy sign to no vacancy, despite having only one expected guest. Rule number 1, no check-ins after 10, regardless of vacancy. At 11:45, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in, a nondescript black sedan that parked directly in front of room 7. I watched through the window as a man stepped out. He looked completely ordinary, maybe in his 50s, average height and build, wearing a well-tailored business suit. His gray hair was cut short and neat, his face unremarkable. If I'd passed him on the street, I wouldn't have looked twice. But this was Pine Ridge Motel at midnight, and ordinary no longer meant safe. The man walked toward the office, his movements precise and controlled. When he entered, the air pressure seemed to change slightly, making my ears pop. "I believe you have a room for me," he said. His voice was pleasant and professional, the kind that could sell you insurance or deliver bad news with equal ease. "Mr. Gray." I nodded, already reaching for the key to room 7. "Yes, sir. Your room is ready." He smiled politely as I handed him the key, his fingers brushing against mine. They felt normal, warm, slightly dry, entirely human. But something in his eyes made me want to pull my hand away faster than politeness allowed. "Thank you," he said, slipping the key into his pocket. "I won't be requiring any services tonight. Please ensure I'm not disturbed." "Of course, Mr. Gray," I replied automatically. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The night is young," he said, his back still to me, "but it will be eventful. Remember your rules, Sarah Mitchell." Before I could react to him using my full name, something I hadn't given him, he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. I watched through the window as he walked directly to room 7, inserted the key, and disappeared inside. The light came on briefly, visible through a gap in the curtains, then went out. For about 5 minutes nothing happened. I sat behind the counter, tense and watchful, waiting for whatever eventful meant in this context. Then every light in the motel flickered simultaneously. First in the office where I sat, then in visible succession through each occupied room's window. The ancient computer screen flashed blue before returning to normal. The digital clock reset itself, the numbers blinking 12 o'clock before slowly scrolling back to the correct time. The phone rang almost immediately. "Front desk," I answered, already knowing what I would hear. "There's something wrong with the electricity in our room," said the older man who had checked into room 1. "The lights keep flickering, and I swear I can hear something in the walls." "I apologize for the inconvenience," I said, the lie coming easily. "We're having some maintenance issues with the electrical system tonight. A technician is working on it now. It should be resolved shortly." Similar calls came in quick succession. The businesswoman in room 2 complaining about the television turning on by itself. A man in room 5 reporting cold spots and strange tapping sounds. I gave them all the same explanation about maintenance issues, promising it would be fixed soon. None of them seemed particularly reassured, but none threatened to check out either. The flickering continued for over an hour, creating a strobe-like effect across the motel. Through my window, I could occasionally see guests peeking through their curtains or stepping outside briefly before retreating back into their rooms. Around 2 in the morning, the electrical disturbances intensified. The lights in the office began to surge, growing painfully bright before dimming to near darkness, then cycling again. The phone rang constantly with increasingly agitated guests. I had just finished another call, this one from a woman whose shower had apparently started running black water, when I noticed something strange through the window. The door to room 1 had opened, and the older guest was standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking around or trying to signal for assistance. He was just standing there, completely still, staring straight ahead. After about 30 seconds, he began walking toward his car. His movements were wrong, too smooth, too coordinated, as if he were being operated by someone who had studied human locomotion but hadn't quite mastered it. He opened his car door, got in, and started the engine without once looking toward the office or showing any awareness of his surroundings. Before I could process what I was seeing, the door to room 2 opened as well. The businesswoman emerged, moving with the same mechanical precision. She walked to her car, got in, and waited with the engine running. One by one, every door opened except room 7. Every guest emerged, walked to their vehicle, and prepared to leave. None of them looked at each other, none of them spoke. They moved like sleepwalkers, synchronized in their eerie silence. At exactly 3 in the morning, they drove away in perfect procession, headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way to the highway. Within minutes, the parking lot was empty except for my car, Granny's station wagon, and Mr. Gray's black sedan. I stood frozen by the window, watching until the last taillights disappeared from view. The motel had fallen completely silent. The electrical disturbances had stopped. The lights were stable again. The phone had ceased ringing. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own breathing, too loud and too fast. The motel felt different now, empty in a way that went beyond the absence of guests. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. I looked toward room 7. The curtains were drawn tight, no light visible from inside, but I could feel something there, a presence that filled the space like a physical weight. Whatever Mr. Gray was, he had emptied the motel of everyone except me. The silence stretched on, unnatural and expectant. I stayed behind my counter, remembering Granny's rules, particularly the one about never going outside between midnight and 5 a.m. I had no intention of breaking that rule tonight, not with whatever was happening in room 7. The night felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. The motel creaked and settled around me, the only sound in the heavy stillness, and I waited, not knowing what would come next, but certain that something would. I stayed behind the counter for the remainder of the night, afraid to move or make a sound. The clock moved forward at an agonizing pace, each minute stretching out uncomfortably long. By 4:30, my eyes burned from exhaustion, but fear kept me alert. The coffee Granny had left me hours earlier sat cold and forgotten. I kept staring at room 7's door, expecting something horrific to emerge at any moment. Nothing did. At 5:45, just as the darkness outside began to fade, room 7's door opened. Mr. Gull. Gray stepped out, briefcase in hand, looking exactly as he had when he arrived. No supernatural aura surrounded him now. He wore the same unremarkable business suit, his posture relaxed but proper. He walked toward the office with measured steps. The bell jingled as he entered. I straightened up, my body tense. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, as if he hadn't caused every other guest to flee in the middle of the night. "I trust you had an uneventful evening?" I didn't know how to respond to such an obvious lie, so I just nodded. "Excellent." He placed the key to room 7 on the counter with a soft click. "Please tell the owner that the inspection went well. The motel continues to serve its purpose." He gave me a polite nod, then turned and walked out before I could form a coherent response. I watched through the window as he got into his black sedan and drove away, taillights disappearing around the bend. The moment his car vanished, the office door connecting to Granny's quarters opened. She emerged holding 2 steaming mugs, her face bearing the same knowing expression I'd seen hints of before. "You look like you need this," she said, placing one of the mugs in front of me. The rich smell of fresh coffee filled the small space between us. "What just happened?" I asked, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "All the guests just left, in the middle of the night, like robots." Granny settled into the chair behind the counter, motioning for me to take the seat beside her. Mr. Gray needed to inspect the place without interference. Inspect it for what? To make sure it's still functioning as intended. She took a sip from her mug, watching me over the rim. "Pine Ridge has stood at this crossroads for over 70 years, Sarah. It serves a very specific purpose." The way she said it made me think she wasn't talking about providing lodging for weary travelers. "What purpose?" I asked. Granny set her mug down and looked at me directly. "This motel is a way station, has been since it was built in 1952. The guests who stay here aren't always from around here." "What do you mean, not from around here?" "Some are just regular folks needing a bed for the night," she explained. "But others are travelers passing between worlds, souls looking for the right door, entities needing a temporary anchor in this reality." I thought about the woman with reflective eyes who had tried to check in after 10, about David and his duplicate, about the distorted children's laughter and the scratches on the window. None of them had seemed entirely human. "The rules," I said slowly. "They're not just random superstitions, are they?" Granny smiled, her face crinkling with approval. "No, they're survival instructions. They keep us safe, and they keep certain things out that shouldn't be allowed in. The woman who came after 10, she wasn't human. She would have fed on you if you'd given her a room." A chill ran through me as I remembered those predatory eyes, and the scratches on the window. Something far worse than the woman. Granny took another sip of coffee. "It hunts by mimicking children. If you'd opened that door..." She trailed off, but I understood. I wouldn't have survived the encounter. "But the rules weren't just for my safety, were they?" I asked, thinking back on each strange night. "You were testing me." Her eyes lit up. "Smart girl." "Yes, I needed to know if you could follow instructions even when they seemed bizarre, even when everything around you defied explanation. Each night was a different test, and you passed them all. Why test me at all? Why not just tell me what this place really is?" Granny sighed, suddenly looking much older and more tired. "Because I need someone to take over. I'm old, Sarah. I've managed this place for almost 50 years, but I can't do it much longer. I need a successor." The realization hit me like a physical blow. That's what the man in the hat meant when he asked if I was ready. She nodded. He's the true owner of Pine Ridge. He appears when transition time approaches, when one caretaker needs to pass the responsibility to another. And you think that should be me? Why? Because you came back, she said simply. After what you saw happen to David, after the thing scratching at the window, after meeting him, most people would have run away screaming, but you came back night after night. I needed the money, I said weakly. Granny laughed, a surprisingly warm sound in the strange morning. Maybe at first, but that's not why you came back yesterday or the day before. You're curious, you want to understand, and most importantly, you can follow the rules even when they make no sense to you. I couldn't argue with that. Something about this place had drawn me back each night, despite the terror I'd experienced. So now you have a choice, Granny continued, her expression growing serious. You can walk away now. I won't stop you. If you choose to leave, the man in the hat will make sure you don't remember any of this. You'll wake up tomorrow thinking you quit a boring night job at a roadside motel. No nightmares, no memories of what you've seen. Or, I prompted when she paused, or you can take over, learn how to manage this place, help the travelers who need to find their way, keep out the ones who mean harm. She gestured around the small office. It's not glamorous work, but it matters. Every soul that passes through here is at a crossroads, just like this motel. If I take over, what happens to you? A small smile touched her lips. I get to rest. I've earned that much. Would I be stuck here forever? The thought of spending decades in this place made my stomach turn. Not forever, she said. Just until you find your own successor. Someone who can follow the rules. Someone who doesn't run from the impossible. She took another sip of her coffee. The pay isn't much, but your needs will be met, and you'll see things few humans ever witness. I stared down into my coffee, thinking about what she was offering. On one hand, a normal life with no memory of duplicates or scratches on windows or men in hats. On the other, a responsibility I never asked for but somehow seemed fitted to me. How did you end up here? I asked. Same as you. Needed a job. Found more than I bargained for. She gazed out at the empty parking lot. I was going to be a teacher, once upon a time. Life had other plans. I looked at Granny's face, tired but peaceful. She had carried this burden for decades, keeping travelers safe, maintaining the boundary between worlds. There was a quiet dignity in that. Some responsibilities choose you, she said, reading my thoughts. Not the other way around. She was right. Whatever force had brought me to Pine Ridge Motel, whatever cosmic coincidence had placed me behind this counter on these specific nights, it wasn't random. The man in the hat had been watching me, testing me, waiting to see if I was worthy. What do I need to do? I asked finally. Granny's face relaxed with obvious relief. For now, just keep working your shifts. I'll teach you everything else, how to recognize who's human and who's not, how to prepare the special rooms, how to keep the boundaries strong. She pointed to the yellowed paper with the 6 rules written in her shaky handwriting. Those are just the basics. There's much more to learn, but you've got time. I picked up the rule sheet, running my fingers over the faded writing. Someday, I would be writing new rules for someone else. Someone brave or desperate or curious enough to work the night shift at Pine Ridge Motel. Someone who would face the same tests I had faced. I didn't know if I was making the right choice, but looking at Granny's face, seeing the burden lifting from her shoulders, I knew it was the only choice I could make.